Welcome to the Cold Case Christianity broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Thanks for joining me at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. Now, in the last few weeks, we've been talking a little bit about the nature of evidence and how it might help you to get ready to talk to people about the gospel. There's a relationship between the rules of evidence and how you might describe them to people, and how you might also ready them for evangelism, ready them to be ready to hear the gospel message. Now, I've been talking about this because it's something I wrote about quite extensively in a book called Forensic Faith. Now, that's a book that is the third in a trilogy of books, Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, and Forensic Faith. And in this third book, what we're trying to do is demonstrate why and how to develop a reasonable, evidential Christian faith, especially as we're trying to navigate the culture and respond to the culture. And first responders are really kind of trained to respond to culture, to be in the world, but not necessarily of the world. And there are some attributes of first responders we might want to adopt if we want to also be ready to respond to culture. And that's what I've been talking about in this book. Now, look, I've been getting a lot of emails from people who subscribe to the daily post. I send out a daily email. You can sign up for it at the website, coldcasechristianity.com. And that's a good way also to hit reply and then respond to me and ask questions. And I get some questions about the content of our show here at NRB TV. And the reason why we're trying our best to provide resources in 28-minute, 30-minute blocks on our TV show. And it is true that sometimes we're just kind of skimming over the surface, surfing across the top of these issues, when really we could do a lot more, of course, in other forms. Now, at our website, coldcasechristianity.com, we spend a lot of time writing about all these issues. And of course, if you want to visit there, all those materials are free. 3 blogs a week, a video a week, a podcast a week, all of which are just free to access. But if you want to take people as deep as you can, you have to go a little more than a 500-word post on a blog, a 30-minute video we do every week for this broadcast in our podcast, and even the 2 or 3 minute videos that we release once a week. Look, all of those are really designed to get you quickly thinking about these issues on a daily basis and the kind of margin you probably have on a daily basis. But to go deeper, you really have to write books because if you're going to talk about something in 70,000 words, you're not going to be able to do that on a show. You're not going to be able to do that on a blog. Those kinds of deep dives into these topics require books. And that's why those of us who work in apologetics, work in Christian case making, we spend the time writing books. Now, I can tell you, when I was not a believer, I used to think, I don't want anything to do with these Christians who are always trying to sell me something. That's what it felt like. And then, of course, in God's sense of humor, years later, I'm a Christian who's selling something, books. But that really isn't the point of our work. The point of our work is to achieve a certain end in the church. And it just so happens that books are the deepest dive you get into the content. But what we're going to do here on our TV show is at least give you a taste of what's in those books, of why we would even take the time to write those books, what motivates us, what are we trying to accomplish in the nature of the church, and why do we think we need to do this at all. Now, today's show, we've been working through the 4 aspects of first responders that I talk about in Forensic Faith. Number 1, do you know what your duty is? Do you know why we have a duty to be Christian case makers, to be able to offer the reason for the hope we have in Jesus? 2, do you know how to train to get ready? 3, do you know how to investigate claims to see if they're true or not? And then finally, we're in the last section of all of this, and that is, do you know enough about how to communicate well? And we learn a lot of this from communicating in front of juries to persuade a group or even an individual that something is true. And you could be using this approach really when you're talking about sharing the gospel, or just talking about your views on any number of social issues that are going up and down in the news on a daily basis. And so you can actually use this approach for lots of ways of communicating. And we've talked already about how important it is to pick the right jurors. So you can go back at our archive of shows, which are available right here at NRB TV and also on our YouTube page. And you can see all the different things we've been talking about as we build this series to a close now. And now what we're going to talk about is, what do you do with that jury before you begin to communicate a case to them? Now, we would never select a jury and then not instruct them as to how to evaluate the case that we're going to present to them. And that's why we have what we call California, and I'm in the state of California, jury instructions. These are instructions that are offered to jurors, and judges provide these instructions along the way so that people get a sense of, well, okay, I get it. There's all these things have been presented to me. These items of evidence have been presented. How am I supposed to evaluate these things? What are some of the rules for evaluating these things? What's the standard of proof we're trying to hit? All of these things are now look, if you don't take the time to instruct jurors in the proper rules of evidence, good luck getting an outcome that makes any sense related to that evidence. We have to actually help jurors understand how to evaluate. This has application for us as Christian case makers, because the reality of it is that a lot of the barriers that I see in communicating the gospel really have to do with an unreasonable expectation or an errant expectation, something that people don't have clearly in their head about the way that evidence is communicated and evaluated. Rather than take a lot of time trying to make the 5 reasons why I think Jesus is God, or the 5 reasons why I think the Gospels are reliable historical accounts, or the 5 reasons why I think God exists based on the evidence in the universe, I better first start to talk to people about, well, this is what a cumulative circumstantial case looks like, and this is why these cases are powerful. I'm about to make one for you, but before I make that case for you, I want to make sure you understand the nature of evidence, the rules of evidence, so when you hear this case, you'll just go, oh yeah, you know what? That's powerful. Because now you understand how cases are made. So we do 2 things with jurors before we even begin to communicate. One, we take the time to select them carefully. We've already talked about that on a past show. And now we take the time to educate them, to instruct them in the way that evidence is to be received and evaluated, and what makes something reliable, what makes something unreliable. These are things that we talk about with jurors before we ever begin to share that case with them. Now, that being said, we'll take a quick break. When we come back, I'm going to give you 3 rules of evidence today that I think actually have practical application to your efforts to share the truth about Christianity with the people you care about. And we'll do that right after the break.
Jim, I've heard you say, I'm not a Christian because it works for me. I'm a Christian because it's true. What is the evidence that convinced you as a former atheist of the claims of Jesus Christ that He's the Son of God?
Well, I mean, I think it's very true that for me, I was somebody who could not have accepted this just on face value because maybe somebody had an experience they wanted to share with me. I mean, I was somebody, as an atheist, I was so committed to my worldview that would not have been persuasive for me. But I think that we are examining, anytime we do an examination of a crime that has happened in the past, this is a non-repeatable event. So we're going to use a form of science called forensic science to be able to look at whether or not we can really know what happened in that event in the distant past. So I think the same kinds of skill sets that we might use to examine any event, a crime scene, for example, or a criminal event, can be used to examine other kinds of historical events. And so this all, to me, came down to the historicity of Jesus, number 1, and the reliability of the eyewitness statements about Jesus, number 2. So those are the 2 things that I think were so critical. And do we believe that the accounts related to Jesus are reliable accounts? And there's ways to test that. I've been testing eyewitness statements for years, and there are 4 criteria. I talk about it all the time. Number 1, are they really there? They wouldn't necessarily claim to be there, but were they really there? 2, can they be corroborated in some way? I don't expect 100% corroboration of any witness account, but I do expect certain touch point corroboration. 3, have they been accurate and honest, or have they changed their story over time? That usually indicates they're lying. And then 4, do they have some bias or something that would cause them to tell me a lie? Drive them, some motive. So I looked at those 4 areas and those 4 concerns for me. I applied that template to the Gospels to see, can I measure them and how well do they stack up in those 4 areas? It turns out that they do pass the test in those 4 areas. Okay, in this section, I want to kind of go through two quick rules of evidence, then we'll take a break and go through the third after the next segment. Now, these are rules of evidence, the nature of evidence, that if you take the time to explain this to the people you're communicating to, it'll really help them to see the weight and the strength of the Christian case. Now, it's also a good idea to communicate these truths to your kids, because I think what happens a lot of times is that young people don't know the rules of evidence, and then when a lie is thrown their way, they're not even quite sure how to use logic and reasoning to kind of sift through whether or not that's a lie. So we could do our own kids a great service simply by helping them to understand these rules in advance. The first one, I think, is one of the most critical, and these are, again, pretty simple ideas, but if you don't think them through in advance, you may miss the power of these ideas. So here's the first simple idea, and that is this. The fact that the other side of any argument can make a case that seems articulate, that seems powerfully constructed, that might even rely on specific pieces of evidence that they are going to use to make their case. The fact that the other side can make a case and even do it persuasively does not mean it's true. Now I realize as I say that might feel like, well, duh. But to be honest, a lot of people don't get this. As a matter of fact, they maybe have kind of secluded themselves or position themselves within their own Christian community where the only voices they hear are the voices of other Christians who believe exactly what they believe. And then the first time they kind of exit that community, or they're out and they hear a persuasive argument. This is why sometimes like YouTube videos, like a movie called Zeitgeist that makes this claim that Jesus is just a borrowed mythology from other prior borrowed mythologies. And it makes it relatively persuasively with this, the music and the movement of the video and experts to come on and talk about these issues. Well, it has impact on, especially on young people who maybe have never heard the other side articulated quite that way. But I have to remind the people who don't quite understand how this works that, look, every time I do a jury trial, we'll spend 6 weeks presenting the evidence for our argument, for presenting the evidence that we think is sufficient to convict someone. And when we get done, it's not like the defense attorney stands up at the end of the table and says, oh, that was so good. Hey, what can I say? We rest. We have nothing we can say to that. No, they're then going to spend their own 4 to 6 weeks making what they hope is an even more persuasive case in the opposite direction. They're going to call their own witnesses. They're going to have their own time in front of that jury, interviewing witnesses, cross-examining ours, presenting their own experts that they think can give a better interpretation of the evidence than our experts gave. And when it's all done, their case is going to look a lot, it can, if it's a good team, it can look as robust, as well articulated, as visual as our case was to begin with. Now, I've done these kinds of cases where both sides present this robust, articulated, well-defined case, and we won. We would get a conviction. And then after this, I have suspects who will confess that they actually did the crime. Now, this is after their defense team has presented this elaborate defense on their behalf. And then they confess that they are guilty of the crime. So clearly, all of that stuff that the defense team did, apparently it wasn't true, because in the end, their guy actually confesses to the crime. So again, the fact that the other side can make an articulate case, can sound persuasive, can write a book, has a PhD, this has no bearing on whether or not it's true. And so I try to help with my own students and with my own kids is, hey, rather than get hung up on the fact they've articulated it well, or hung up on the fact their book or movie or whatever was well produced, let's kind of break down what the evidence is they're using to make the case to begin with. It's not about the persuasiveness of their presentation. It's about the persuasiveness of the evidence. As a matter of fact, our persuasive effort in a closing argument or in an opening statement does not go back with the jury to be evaluated. Did you know that? So I can put together this huge multimedia presentation. That jury gets to see that once in trial. It's not evidence. My argument is not evidence. My argument is simply an argument, and neither argument is going to go back with the jury. What they're going to get to evaluate in that jury room is just the evidence. They may have taken notes during the argument, but they are instructed by the judge to remember that the argument is not evidence. Do not get hung up on persuasive arguments. Even mine. Even if I've got a book and I give it to my kids, I wouldn't trust me for it. Go back and find the sources of that and put together your own case. The evidence matters more than the argument. Here is the second rule of evidence that I think will help you to articulate the Christian worldview to your friends and family members. This is why we take time to instruct in the rules of evidence. And here it is. Everything, now we talked about this before on other shows, everything has the potential to be used as evidence. It's not, the problem sometimes is that we overlook things that I always say are hiding in plain sight because we don't remember this simple rule. Everything has the potential to be used as evidence. Now in the past we've talked about this on the show. You can go back and review that it's not just what we see. It's what we could have seen at the crime scene, but it was missing from the crime scene. It's not just what the suspect says, it's what he could have said but failed to say. It's both the positive and the negative that's in the picture we're looking at as evidence. The smallest little things can be used as evidence. As a matter of fact, in the kids' version of Forensic Faith, unsurprisingly and probably not creatively called Forensic Faith for Kids, we just finished writing it, Susie and I, and we just submitted it to the publisher. And in there we have a scene where we have to help young people understand how important this is. Because we make a case there for the deity of Christ, right, in this book. And we ask the kids to look at small little things you might have overlooked. We've talked about it on this show before. For example, the idea that Old Testament prophets are consistently heard to say, "Thus saith the Lord." The Lord Almighty says. This is the way Old Testament prophets always begin their statements when speaking for God. But Jesus never, ever once says, "Thus saith the Lord." Instead, Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you." Or, "I say this to you." What? Really? Because he's not speaking as somebody who's a prophet speaking for God. He's speaking as the Son of God, speaking as God. Now look, you could very easily jump over those kinds of things in Scripture. You could very easily run right past certain attributes of history without even thinking they have any importance. But remember, every word matters. Every little thing that you think you might have just skimmed over matters. Go back through your Scripture. Read those, especially the Gospels. Read the accounts of Jesus' words and then start to think clearly about look, when you make choices in statements, those choices are important because there's things you chose not to say. This is why when I'm interviewing a suspect, I'm very careful to look at every word and the way he's using words and evaluate those against the way he could have said it but chose not to. Remember, everything has value. And by the way, when someone says to you, "That's just a small," typically what will happen is the objector will say, that's not significant enough. Well, no, this is the way we build cases. This is the way it's little things. It's the fact that that cigarette butt was pointing in that direction that matters to us. It's little signs that maybe he was right-handed or left-handed. And you might walk right past these kinds of things at a crime scene. But these are the kinds of things that matter. And they may seem small. They may seem hidden. They may seem unimportant. Everything in that crime scene, every aspect of that room, matters to me because everything has the potential. This is why every word on the page of Scripture has that kind of value and weight. All right, we'll take a break. We'll come back after this break and take a little more time on the third instruction that I'd like to see you give to people before you actually present the case for Christianity.
Welcome to the 1 Minute Apologist. We interview the world's leading apologists to provide credible answers to curious questions.
How do we know that the Gospels are reliable?
Well, I looked at them originally as a skeptic. I was only interested in the words of Jesus. I was willing to entertain the possibility that Jesus was a smart guy, but not really that he was God. But as I read through the accounts to get out the red letters of Jesus' wisdom, I was struck by the similarities that I saw in the accounts that I also saw in multiple eyewitness accounts to the same event in my professional work. So for me, it was a matter of assessing the accounts like you would assess other eyewitness accounts about the past. And that's something that I was very familiar with. There's a 4-part template, in fact, that I use to do just that. And it comes from the list of jury recommendations that we offer juries, criminal juries in California, a number of maybe 12 to 14 questions that we allow jurors to consider in their mind when they're assessing eyewitnesses on the stand to see if they're credible or reliable. It all breaks down into 4 large categories. Number 1, was the witness really there when they said they were there? Are they present? Or are they just lying about the fame of the case or whatever it may be? 2, can they be corroborated in some way so we can kind of see if they're verified from another witness or some other piece of evidence? 3, have they changed their story? Are they accurate? Are they telling us the truth? And has it changed, their narrative changed over the years? And finally, it's really about bias. Is there something in the nature of the eyewitness that would cause them to lie for some selfish gain? Those are the 4 areas we look at. So I think if we applied that same kind of a template to the Gospels, we would at least come away with an understanding about whether or not the eyewitness accounts of the Gospels are reliable. Now, before we finish the show for this week, I want to share with you a claim that's often made related to the burden of proof. I know we've talked about this in some ways in other broadcasts, but I want to specifically talk about how you can use this jury instruction to help make a case. Look, it's often said that, and it's true, and here's the instruction just so you can see it, as I stated to others, whoever makes the claim has the burden of proof. Whoever makes the claim has the burden of proof. And how this is sometimes used against us, leveraged against us by objectors or skeptics, is that they'll say, well, look, you're the one who's claiming there's a God that I can't see. If you're going to claim there is some causal agent called God, when that's not obvious to all of us, then that burden of proof is on you. As a matter of fact, I want to read to you, and I wrote a lot about this in the book, and unfortunately, again, we're skimming across the surface, but I want to read to you a statement on a popular atheist website. So here it is. This is a statement that was made on a website, someone who wrote an article, and he's describing the burden of proof. Here's what he says. The burden of proof falls on whoever makes a positive claim. If I claim the flying spaghetti monster exists, again, this is that kind of pejorative that's sometimes used when we're talking about the existence of God, when atheists talk about it. If I claim the flying spaghetti monster exists, it's not your duty to disprove me. In fact, that might be impossible. Rather, it's my duty to back up my claim with reasons and evidence. If you claim that Yahweh exists, it's not my duty to disprove Yahweh. In essence, he's saying, hey, if you're going to make this claim that this God exists, burden of proof's on you. Well, look, I think he's right about that, in the sense that this is also true in criminal trials, right? We have a burden of proof, especially when we're dealing with criminal trials involving a suspect who has a right to be considered innocent until we prove otherwise. The burden is high for us. I get that, and it should be. But don't think for a second that every side doesn't make a claim when it comes to this argument about whether or not everything... Let me put it to you this way. The best way to illustrate this is what we do at crime scenes. And I get to a crime scene, there'll be like 10 pieces of evidence sitting at the crime scene. Maybe 100 pieces of evidence. And we're standing outside that yellow tape, my partners and I, looking over that tape into that crime scene, and we're saying to ourselves, okay, sometimes we'll make a quick, kind of guesstimation, kind of an informed guesstimation on what we think might be the cause here. So let's say we worked this thing together for a month, and we are now looking at photographs of the crime scene on a whiteboard. And so we're all assembled in the same room. Now my partner, now it's no longer a guess. We've actually spent time investigating the evidence for a month. Now I might say in that meeting, based on the evidence I'm seeing here, I think that the most reasonable inference for the suspect is the brother-in-law. And my partner might say, well, no. Based on what I'm seeing here in this room, the most reasonable inference for the evidence is his sister. Well, is it the brother-in-law or the sister? Now, I'm going to have the burden of proof to demonstrate how the evidence in that crime scene is best explained by the brother-in-law. But the person who makes the counterclaim also has to make a case for why he or she thinks that the sister is the best explanation for the evidence in the room. Each of us proposes a causal agent, a causal suspect, a cause, and then each of us has a burden to explain why our cause is sufficient or does the best job of explaining the evidence. Now, something very similar happens, and I talk about this in a book called God's Crime Scene. in which I look at the entire universe as though it's a crime scene, and I try to ask the question, what is the best inference for the cause of all the evidence in the universe? Now look, as it turns out, there are only two kinds of causal explanations for that evidence. One is that this is a natural set of forces that are unguided, that they are just, it's natural law that causes this kind of thing to occur, and it can explain all the evidence in the room. We would say, well, no, it's a divine creator that is the best explanation, is the best or most reasonable inference related to a cause. Well, if you're saying that God is the cause of those pieces of evidence in the universe, okay, fine. I've got a burden now. I've got to show why I think God is the most reasonable explanation. Not a gap. That's not because I can't explain it any other way. I need to actually show why, in a positive sense, an intelligent, all-powerful, all-loving standard of moral goodness, a standard of moral righteousness, is the best explanation for all the evidence I see in the universe. Now, there's also a burden, though, on the person who's standing with me on the other side of the yellow tape, who says, no, there's evidence in that crime scene, the universe, but I think there's a better explanation for that evidence. I think that just natural law alone can get that done. That you don't need a causal agent, I just need a cause. Okay, fine. Now, you're going to have to show me, though, how it is that your cause accounts for the evidence better than my cause. We each have a burden because each of us is proposing a cause of his own or her own. My causes are divine. His causes or her causes are just natural laws. Fine. We each have a burden. Don't think for a second, though, that when we're trying to explain why the universe is the way it is, why all the stuff we see in the universe is the way it is, that we're the only ones as theists that have a burden. No, both of us have a burden, because the only other explanation is that natural laws can get that done. Well, then that burden is on you to show me why it is natural laws are sufficient. And the reason why I bring this up is because it's so important for us not to let this be the conversation killer. When we're talking to somebody and they say, hey, burden's not on me to prove you wrong. I mean, I'd be able to prove you wrong, because how would I prove a negative? It's on you to prove you're right. Well, okay, no, but look, aren't we both saying that there are sufficient causes for the evidence in the universe? Okay, fine, I'll shoulder my burden. I'll be happy to shoulder my burden. But that means you're going to have to also shoulder your burden. And as you do that, trust me on this, because I looked at 8 pieces of evidence in the universe, that's a heavy burden they're not going to be able to shoulder. Anyway, that's the third rule of evidence I want you to master when you talk to your friends. Remember, teaching the rules of evidence is helpful when you're getting someone ready to hear the gospel. Hope that helps, and I'll see you right back here next week at the Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. It's available wherever books are sold.